The main chunk of the second module, which is, I'm going to talk about luminance, and then, the rest of the module talks about color vision, but I'm going to talk about luminance, and then I'm going to introduce an idea, and that idea will carry over into the rest of the module, which I'll hopefully finish next week and segue that into the third module. Also, I wasn't able to do the second portion of the temporal spatial theory of consciousness, and hopefully, again, I'll make time and do that next week. But yeah, one of the things I'm doing with these studies of perception and consciousness is I'm ultimately trying to go back into the temporal spatial theory of consciousness and some of my own ideas about it and potentially future work in that area with with Nordhoff, who created that theory. Okay. So sorry, this is week 1. Okay. Okay. So in week 2, we're talking about luminance and lightness, right? So light and dark are the most basic visual properties of vision, right? So not all animals necessarily see color, but all animals which have vision do see lightness. They can detect how much light there is. And so luminance refers to the physical measurement, the objective measurement of light intensity per area, and that can be measured in candelas per meter square or whatever you choose. And then lightness is the subjective measurement. Psychophysically, you can use these paradigms to get an objective measure of a subjective experience, but it's ultimately the perception of the intensity of light reflected from some object's surface. And of course, this is subjective, and so there's not a one-to-one correspondence between luminance and lightness. And that's the ultimate theme of this course, which is that luminance and lightness are not the same. Objective properties about the world and our perceptions of them are not the same. There's a discrepancy there, right? And then how does the brain deal with that discrepancy is the ultimate problem. And by the end of this presentation, I hope to provide some answer to how do we deal with the discrepancy in this regard in the case of luminance and lightness. So again, these discrepancies are non-trivial between lightness, the perception of luminance, referring to the actual physically measurable properties of the light, right? And so here's one illusion of lightness. I would appreciate if everyone could just unmute themselves and tell me which gray tile they think is lighter, or if you think they're lighter. You guys might differ on what your perceptions of. Which one?
They look the same.
The same?
They look the same.
Okay. The typical answer is actually that this one is going to look. Most people are going to say that this one looks lighter. And so, for years and years, visual scientists were trying to figure out why this may be. But ultimately, the important thing to recognize that even though these are the same, and you guys are now perceiving them to be the same, but in all conditions you may not, ultimately, your perception of the lightness is going to depend on the information around it, right? And so it's not an objective measure, right? Whereas if you're detecting luminance, you would just detect directly, okay, these have the same luminance. But if you're detecting lightness and perceiving it, it's very important to consider the information around it. And so part of the explanation of this is the receptive field. So if anyone remembers from last week, the receptive field is the field in your visual space for which a given neuron responds to, and the sort of properties it's responding to. So in the case of detecting light, right, a neuron is going to detect light in the center of its perceptual field, and it's also going to detect light in the surrounding of its perceptual field, right, or its receptive field. It's important to note that so this isn't a map of the retina itself, right? This is a more abstract map of a portion of the retina for which a given neuron is responding, right? So this is an abstract concept, and it applies to, you get these pretty ordinary, these actual shaped receptive fields for all neurons running from, the retina to the primary visual cortex. They all do have a defined receptive field, and these fields would all occupy spaces on the retina and whatever. And so the important thing is that what you find here is that if we're talking about the case of detecting luminance or lightness, right? What happens is if light is shown in the middle of a neuron's receptive field, so some area on the retina for which it's responding to, if light is shown on the middle of its receptive field, it's going to increase firing. If light is shown on the what's called the surround of its receptive field, that's actually going to inhibit firing, right? And so one of the explanations of why do we get this illusion edges, right? So in naturally occurring edges, the edges may create relative to elicitation of firing. And I have further examples to explain that. But the ultimate thing to get from this slide is that so light or stimulus that the neuron is detecting or processing, stimulus directed to the center of its receptive field has a positive effect on firing. Stimulus directed towards the outside of the field has a negative effect. So if you, for example, had maximal stimulus input here and then minimal here, that's going to create the most firing possible, right? Because this is inhibitory and that elicits firing, right? Okay. So here's the explanation of edges and how may just the natural occurrence of edges and having to deal with those explain the illusions we see with luminance. For example, if you have an edge, right, represented by the stimuli, what you see here is it's only covering the edge of the receptive field, and therefore the surrounding, the periphery, it's creating a lot of inhibition. But if you get the stimulus on the middle of the receptive field, some of the edge, but not all of the surround, you get maximal firing. This right here is maximal firing. It's just covered this, right? But it's left out some of the inhibitory region, and therefore you get an unrealistic sense that this thing is more luminant than it really is. And then here you would get what is a baseline firing, right? So if the whole stimuli covers the entire receptive field of a given neuron, well, then what you get is a baseline firing where inhibition and center receptive field are both being stimulated. However, there are shortcomings to this approach. But for the time being, important to note the edge explanation was accepted for a time, and some may have been accepted today. But so here's the importance of edges just from an evolutionary perspective and a perspective of allowing us to navigate the world. So this is an eye tracking image, and this is a depiction of that image, or just the general principle. What we do in looking at a face, and this is true of adults, probably everyone in this room, unless you maybe have autism or are blind, you stare the triangulation of the face, and if the person has a dark hairline relative to fair skin, you typically look a lot at the hairline too. This may differ for adults, but for babies, they'll look a lot at a dark hairline relative to whiter skin. If the person is, for example, blonde, they're not really going to pay it much attention, but they do like edges a lot, right? And of course, the eyes and mouth, from an evolutionary social perspective, are important pieces of information for expressing emotion, right? So we really pay a lot of information to this triangulation, and also, of course, we're tracking the eyes of the person we're looking at. So yeah, we look a lot at these regions, and ultimately these regions are edges, right? And so if you think about in general, edges and contrast to visual information provide important information of the features of objects and the segregation between objects and what have you, and that way you can navigate the world and better understand it. So here's another example of this this illusion of luminance. I'm sure everyone can see tile A and tile B. Tile A and tile B. Does anyone want to have a guess and say which is actually more luminant than the other? Evan, do you have any idea which tile is more luminant than the other? Okay, so typically we would perceive tile B as being more luminant or lighter, but in fact, if you put a finger So if you put your finger here, you'll see that these tiles are actually equal to one another in luminance. And this one, cast in a shadow, helps us create a perception that it is lighter than this, but it's actually not in terms of physical measurement. Moreover, it's important to note that in according with the edge theory, the receptive field theory of how is it that this illusion occurs, what you see is that this white stimuli is surrounded by a lot of black stimuli, right? So if you think about a receptive field, as the previous explanation would go, the center of the receptive field here is white, right? And the center of all these receptive fields are white, right? And then what you're having is in the inhibitory region, you're having less white. So you're having less stimulation, right? And so ultimately the stimulus is less inhibited over here, right? And it ultimately creates, it's in the center of the receptive field, so it elicits more firing and results inevitably in, this perception of greater luminance. But one of the shortcomings of this approach is that you can actually get this effect using the opposite surrounding information. And so the receptive field theory doesn't really hold here. But here's an additional example where you can get this sort of thing happening, even though you're not getting, what might happen with the receptive field. So for example, here you're seeing these two sides of this cube or whatever. And in fact, these two sides of the cube have equal luminance, right? So if you put your finger over that middle edge, you find that the luminance on the bottom and the top square are the same. And what creates the between them, gradient in between. So it's important to note here that there's not a one-to-one correspondence between luminance and lightness. And again, there's other perceptual illusions where you see, for example, you'll get like a white square surrounded by, a gray square surrounded by a white square, and the gray square will stand out as being brighter than it really is, which can happen here. Or alternatively, you have the gray square surrounded by darker information, and that can also create an enhancement of lightness. And so the question is why, right? And one answer that Dale offers is quite, it feels very theoretical, it feels very abstract, it feels very elegant. It's very, very interesting. And it's kind of beautiful in the simplicity, but also a decent degree of complexity. So, we'll get there in a moment. But in any case, these two things are achieving this contrast again, using a gradient in between them and a very different approach. And so what gives essentially, right? And so here's another example of this perceptual illusion of luminance, which is what's called Mach bands. And so if you look here, in the middle of this gradient of light, right, you may see the perception of some band in this area. Okay. Can someone confirm with me that they're seeing a band in this area?
Yep.
Yeah. And of course, like, I'm sure you can assume by now that band is only an illusion. It doesn't actually exist. This is really a gradient from dark to light. So here's an objective graph of the actual luminance of this this graph, right? So you're going from dark, and then you're going from a transition to light, right? And so the Mach band, this is a graph of the lightness we're seeing. And so we go dark, okay, darker than it actually is in terms of lightness. And then we see the gradient, and then we see lighter than it actually is, right? So to date, there's no thorough, robust explanation of all of these phenomena, but that fully captures and answers everything there is to know about each of them. But Dale does offer, or Pervs offers one explanation, which is quite interesting. And an additional comment I'd like to make, a problem that Pervs doesn't address, but I think, as I was thinking about it, here's a problem. If you take a receptive field approach, right? So in neurons which are responding to the retina in the fovea, right? So again, in the retina, you have a concentration of photoreceptors for color, right? Your cones and your most acute visual information is in the fovea, which is a very small portion of the retina. And so the receptive fields of those neurons corresponding to the fovea are very acute. They're very small, right? And so presumably, if you're looking at some stimulus, the receptive fields of what's in your fovea, because your fovea is always what's focused on what you're looking at, right? That's why you move your eyes towards it. So those receptive fields would presumably cancel one another out, right? They would be crossed all over one another, and I would imagine that you would ultimately, this receptive field to edge approach would fail here because they would be canceling each other out, because one receptive field would have more inhibitory stimulation and the other would have more, elicitatory. So you would get this canceling out. Okay. So here's the explanation that Perv suggests may explain why is it that we see these illusions of luminance, right, of lightness. So ultimately, he takes it back to the frequency for which these sorts of patterns would emerge in nature, right? So over the course of evolution, he emphasizes that we didn't learn from whole scenes of information, right? Our ancestors didn't learn from, a given scene and seeing the whole thing, because presumably each individual would only see one scene ever, right, from a certain perspective and whatever. From a computational approach, you're only going to get that scene probably once, but there's going to be little patches of visual information within that scene which you'll encounter multiple times. Perhaps, those patches of visual information occur even multiple times in a given scene, right? So presumably our ancestors would have encountered those little patches throughout their lives, and then, over the course of evolution, you have you have a large sample of those visual patches, and you can learn from those tiny little visual patches of visual information. So what a group of scientists have done is, they sample many patches from, natural images of actual images from diverse parts of the world. And what you find is if you sample little visual patches from large natural images, so you take many samples across many images, what you find is that if you get anyways, what you find is that so if you just take any random bit of visual information, right, what you're going to find is what's most likely to be found is that the center of that visual information is going to be like its surrounding, right? And likely, the center of the visual information is either a lot brighter or a lot darker, right? And so what Purves is suggesting that we're actually perceiving is the relative frequency for which these things occur, right? And of course, the relative infrequency for which a patch of visual information occurs at a fundamental level either indicates novelty or perhaps something else which is important and should be therefore salient, right? So it could, a contrast could represent an important feature of an object, or it could represent, a segregated different object, but nonetheless, it's something which should be salient and attended to, and therefore we give it emphasis of being, lighter than it really is, right? And this in turn makes it more salient perceptually, right? In fact, Perf suggests that we can predict how light someone will think a center of visual information is relative to the surroundings if you, if you make the center more extreme from the surroundings, right? So if you make it a lot brighter or a lot darker, it's going to be seen as more luminant than it really is. The center will be seen as more luminant than it really is. Okay. So ultimately, the important thing to consider here then is that we're not operating in a psychophysical space where we're estimating reality based on its properties, right? So we're not estimating how luminant something is, but instead we're actually operating in a perceptual space, a model in our head from randomly generated perceptions of sensation. So for example, like what he's suggesting happens at a fundamental level over the course of human evolution is that as you have ancestors interpreting these patches of visual information, those which interpret the center to surround. So those who interpret extreme center surrounds as being lighter than they actually are have survived, right? And so those who have perceived it in this way have sort of passed it on to us at a fundamental level. And this has only been refined over selection, right? And so maybe those who haven't done this, weren't able to distinguish an important stimuli within its environment. For example, some bright predator, which stood out from the surroundings. If it wasn't able to make that thing more salient than it was, it's less likely to detect it, and therefore, it doesn't avoid it. Or alternatively, maybe you see a bright fruit relative to a dark background, you're less likely to see it. So if you make it more salient than it actually is perceptually, now it's more easy to see and navigate that fruit and therefore eat or whatever, like some prey you're hunting. So ultimately it comes down to, these randomly generated biases in perceptual processing. Processing have been I don't know what
Hey, Aidan, you're cutting out a bit.
Hey guys.
Hey.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Hello?
Seems like you're still cutting out.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep. Now we can hear you.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Where did I cut out at?
You were covering the kind of one theory as to, I think you mentioned psychophysical space. It was a bit after that. Like our perception isn't psychophysical.
Sorry,
Perceptual.
Okay, yeah. So I guess like what I was just saying is that our perception of reality isn't based on these estimates of, the actual physical properties of reality, but rather on the infrequency for which a visual patch would actually emerge. Sorry, I keep cutting out. I don't know why that is. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah. So your perception of reality isn't based on estimates of what reality actually looks like, but it's more so based off of biases which have accumulated over evolution, which are, as the visual patch becomes less frequent, right? And what is less frequent is if you have a center which is less like its surrounding, it becomes more salient, and evolution has selected for this bias to make it more salient perceptually. Because, again, like if you're discriminating features within an object or objects from one another, whether it be a predator, a prey, relative to a background, whatever, it's allowed us to better navigate and survive and reproduce and whatever. Sebastian, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, so I guess why I noted it would be like with that idea of this constructed perception, just having different things, picking and not necessarily picking and choosing, but just highlighting, okay, what's important. I guess that would be supportive of, that argument of constructivism. Maybe like the world is partially construed. Now I wouldn't go entirely and say this is, 100% supporting constructivism, maybe more like a relative constructivism, more like a pseudo constructivism, but I think they will kind of like support that idea. But yeah, that was
like
something I had.
Yeah, like there's a guy named Donald Hoffman, and he runs. I don't actually understand his work entirely, but I understand his conclusion. Like I know what his conclusion is, and that's obviously dangerous. And I want to look into his work more, so I understand his methodology. But what he suggests is that him and his research team, and they basically suggests, and he wasn't the first to suggest this. It was actually a PhD student of his, but they suggest that the probability for which we're perceiving reality as is zero. It's virtually zero. Very, very small probability that we're actually estimating the features of reality. But rather, what we're doing is we're estimating the evolutionary meaning of a thing, and that's our perceptual space. So it's not like the models in your head, which are calculating what is going on around you, is not calculating what reality looks like. It's calculating the significance of it. And so you're kind of operating in a space of meaning or values or whatever, right?
Good point, yeah.
Importantly, one thing I just want to address, which I wasn't able to address, is that this approach overcomes the inverse problem, right? So if anyone remembers the inverse problem, it's a general problem in the field of sensation and perception, which is that our sensory organs are limited, right? So for example, in our retina, we're detecting two-dimensional information, right? And what you get is that a particular patch of information on the retina can be interpreted in an infinite number of three-dimensional shapes, right? And this also applies to colors, and it applies to motion, and it applies to all sorts of physical stimuli. You can interpret them perceptually in like an infinite number of ways because the sensory organ is limited, and you have to extrapolate beyond it, right? So he's getting around that problem by saying, well, we're not actually estimating the physical features of reality. We're actually we're just estimating patterns of the stimulus, right? The stimulus itself. We're estimating patterns of what we get based on how important they are, and then we're operating on the importance itself, if that makes any sense, right? So the perceptual in terms of vision, right? Like you can represent this thing as you get a visual stimuli in the retina, right? So you're getting photons hitting the retina, right? And this is skewed by the fact that you have transmittance, reflectance, and illumination all interacting with one another to producing the way the photon hits your retina. But ultimately, you're trying to predict, one of those three things. But that's the inverse problem. How can you predict one of those things, right? If you have three terms, so it can be represented, mathematically by, for example, x equals, a times b times c. You can't find a, b, or c if all you have is x, right? So that's the inverse problem. And he's saying, well, we're getting away from the inverse problem. We're getting around it by saying, no, we're just operating on the meaning of x itself. How important is the stimuli we're getting? Not what does it mean in terms of an objective sense, but no, what does it lead to, right? Does this kill me or not, right? And one thing I wanted to point out too is that I think this overcomes a derived problem related to the inverse problem, which I don't know if I'm just saying it's derived from the inverse problem. It's sort of a problem that I've thought about. I haven't seen it detailed anywhere specifically, but here's the problem, right? We can operate in an abstract space of information processing. Like that's kind of obvious, right? But what's not obvious is the initial learning, right? So it almost seems like you need some tie to objective reality to then be able to operate in abstraction, right? Like it's almost like, for example, you want to teach someone math. Well, you have to just like teach them what a number is, not in an abstract space, but you need to teach them, like you count with them, you count physical objects. Sorry. Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So you have to count physical objects, and you have to understand empirically like what is reality before you get into abstract processing. That's kind of a derivation from the inverse problem. So for example, like you want to talk about, okay, you abstractly process visual information. Well, you need at least some base to return to what is reality in a visual sense. And if you're not doing that, then maybe you need to reinforce the initial learning of vision from other perceptions. For example, in somatic perception, maybe the entirety of vision is abstract and untied to estimates of reality, right? but maybe they're tied to pain, right? Which is a perception of the somatic, right? How the somatic is relating to reality. Maybe they're tied to pain, and pain is this estimate of, how does a thing maybe affect homeostasis or whatever, right? But then I was thinking, and I was like, well, no, this whole thing could be abstract, right? From this perspective, right? Because even pain could be removed from an estimate of reality and how something affects homeostasis or whatever, and rather it could just be that ancestors which perceived a particular pattern of sensation as pain survived, right? And those who didn't perceive it as pain, for example, someone who is congenitally analgesic, is more likely to die or suffer a serious injury, maybe even to the reproductive system or whatever, or maybe they're so disfigured they don't get to reproduce or whatever, right? So those who didn't incorrectly interpret pain as pain just died. And so they did not necessarily interpret anything. Like, what's not being reinforced is how accurate you interpreted reality. What's being reinforced is how accurate did you respond to something which was evolutionarily important. Okay. I think that's all I really have to say. I didn't see at what point Evan left. Did he log out a while ago? Did anyone see that?
Yeah.
Okay. Does anyone have? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions? Any comments? Was that weird? Was that understandable? Was that easy and simple? Like, what do you guys think?
I thought it was understandable.
Yeah, I got most of it.
It was crazy.
I think what stuck with me was mostly the second part of the presentation being, what's valuable to us and how we perceive that value. Now going from the first part of the presentation, it was really interesting looking at that, those bends, like that there's not actually any lines between those gradients, but we think that they're darker and that we think that they're lighter. So, but throughout the entire presentation, I was really thinking, okay, yeah, that's the importance of the environment around how we look at one particular thing. So I might be looking at B, but I have to also consider like the other things surrounding the letter B too, right? So, and that could be applied to different things. And I like how you applied it to kind of like, back to the ancestors, how they interpreted, the relevance of, let's say, B, right? So, and I think that could tie into any part of our, like, not only like perception and like the very like concrete part of it, but also like a social part of it too, in the sense of like, okay, you're looking at one thing, but what is the environment around that? And I think that ties into what, I was kind of mentioning too, like, there's so much in like that social world that's so important that you have to consider. So I was just kind of backing it forth with what you were saying, kind of tying it back to what I'm saying, but very much like on that concrete level, looking at one perception and how it's influenced by, the environment around it. So thanks.
Yeah, I would say a couple of things in response to that, which is that, this stuff is mainly thought about in a very fundamental sense, right? So you have these lab experiments with very simple stimuli, very lab-controlled stimuli. In fact, like these stimuli for which you look at can be so controlled that I was talking to one guy who does these sorts of experiments, and he was like painting the walls in his lab black because he didn't want the light reflectance of the wall to distract anyone or whatever. So like they heavily control these things, and what you're trying to get at is you're trying to get very controlled things for which you can then interpret how the brain is processing them, and then you can generalize, right? So you say, okay, if you're doing this to this little pattern, right, this is how we might process a larger scene, right? And then, of course, what you're saying is that not only are we visually interpreting, the fundamental aspects of importance and whatever, but we're interpreting the social stuff. And I definitely agree with you, right? Like that has probably been driven by evolution. That's sort of, for example, like I was showing how the eye saccades around the face, and it looks at the face, right? Like it really looks at the eyes and mouth a lot because those are really important for expressing emotions, and also like, if you see someone look in a direction, you will probably look at whatever they just looked at. You will track what they looked at because the assumption is that something important happened. nothing verbal happen, but you are just it's an instinct, right? It's something that, just because ancestors used to do it, the ancestors who used to do it survived better than the ones who didn't. And so now most of us do that, right? And one thing I would like to say is that, evolution, interestingly, it's selected for us to look at the faces in this way and whatever, and look at, the fundamental features. That's kind of universal. But in the social evolution, right, it's like, okay, it had us look at these faces like this. And one of the things I noted that unless you're autistic, right, you're going to do this. This is how babies analyze a face coming into the world. Is it this and then that, right? But a lot of here, right? And actually, they really like faces in humans. They like looking at faces, especially new faces, but they really like it. So the interesting thing is, well, what is the evolutionary advantage of autism? Is it evolutionary advantageous? Perhaps Newton was autistic, and a lot of the great geniuses who have excelled in STEM field and mathematics. And the idea is that, why do autistic people not, like babies, they're not going to look so much at the face like that, and they're not going to be very interested in people, but rather, like, you show them a scene, and there can be people in this scene. The autistic child will look a lot at the objects in the scene. And the idea here is that they're learning about the physical world, right? And then they can make, leaps and bounds in physics and math. And perhaps that's something that evolution wasn't able to fully, I don't know, weed out. But conversely, maybe this helped us survive at a social level, right? So, and again, evolution happens at a population level. So, anything which maybe led to some autism, some balance between autism and non-autism, right? And you can have that on a gradient, right? It's called the autistic quotient. And as you get people who are autistic but still like functional, and they're developing objects for each within society, right? Because you think about maybe people who are a little more autistic, a little more nerdy, right? They're the reason why we ultimately left cave life, right? They're the ones who would have developed spears and saws and hammers and tires and wheels and all the amazing things we use today, and computers probably, right? So, yeah. Okay. I'm assuming no one has any questions or any comments. Ahmed, I'm interested in what you would have to say. Is this just a crazy theory? What do you think Purvis is onto? Is he onto something? Is he wasting his time or what?
I mean, I can't say I'm an expert about this topic. I did take a course that did touch on visual perception, and no, I don't think he's necessarily crazy. I mean, it makes sense. It's valuable, I guess. How we perceive the world is probably still much of a mystery, because we're essentially telling ourselves how we perceive the world through our own perspective, which comes with its own interesting consequences. Because if you're looking at something that someone else is looking at, can't really prove that you both saw the same thing, but it's just kind of cool that that's happening. And perception is largely, obviously, I feel like even when you're a child, what you're developing is an ability to figure out what is important. You have an innate sense of what is important, but you'll also develop what you can also see as important. So think about, let's say you start playing sports, right? You start to develop, a sense of what is dangerous in this situation in terms of whatever your goal is. So I think it's really cool. I think it's not completely innate. I think there's a learning aspect to it, but also
definitely. Like, we learn a lot in how to process fundamentals of vision, right? First 3 months of life and beyond that. But I think I've definitely said before in these weekly meetings or whatever that, like, before 3 months old, people usually don't study infants, right? So they only study vision usually beyond 3 months old. It's very difficult to pull it off before 3 months because they're so bad at depth perception that you can only really study what they can see from this far away, right? And then you also need to, like, really limit distractions because they don't have great attention, so they can't really attend to objects so good. But people study this as well, right? Like, what does expert learning do to the way you saccade, right? So an expert in whatever given task is going to look at the scene information very, very differently from those who don't do it, right? So for example, like I was once watching a video of Mike Tyson explaining to a non-boxer where does he look in a boxing match. He's like, oh, I look at the shoulder, because the guy asked you, he said, no, I look at their shoulders because their face can't hit me, and everyone laughed, and it's like, well, clearly the expert is looking at the important information, what he's learned from personal experience, what is important in that situation. But in this approach where you're talking about what has evolution selected for, it's a very fundamental selection where it's like those who didn't give salience to the rare features in a pattern of visual information, just small patterns of visual information, those who didn't give salience to the rare ones, which are, anytime you have a center of visual information with a surrounding which is a lot different, so whether it be, darker black or, lighter, the more different that thing, the more salient the center appears, even whether it be surrounded by black or whiter. And this approach has actually been used to study other things like color and other features of perception. So for to be more salient, which I hope to speak in later weeks. But yeah, thank you guys for coming. If anyone doesn't have anything left, I'll just go. Have a good week, everyone.
All right,
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah. See you guys next week or